Hi everyone, Joe Kral, President of the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. This week we're going to cover some more in vitro fertilization issues. We're going to talk a little bit more about how surrogacy as an issue actually is a pro-life issue. And we're going to talk about a piece of legislation that's going on in South Dakota. It's House Bill 1096. It just passed out of committee over there just the other day, and it's actually getting ready to be voted on the House probably within the next week or so. So we'll be talking a little bit about that bill, what's going on with that bill, why I support that bill, why it's a good pro-life bill, and so forth. And we'll talk about a couple other legislative measures that we could look into with respect to regulating the IVF or in vitro fertilization industry as a whole. Now, one of the things I want to make crystal clear, and I know I've said this in other videos as well, and that is when it comes to in vitro fertilization, this is a pro-life issue. I cannot stress that enough. And I think we, as a pro-life movement, and certainly leaders of pro-life organizations, we really need to step it up a notch, if you will, to protect these embryonic children that are created. They're the most vulnerable at this point in time in existence. And so many of them are created and so many of them are destroyed. And so we need to do our utmost as a movement to get involved in passing legislation that protects these embryonic human persons. So let's talk a little bit about this. Let's also talk about surrogacy, and in particular, this surrogacy bill that's happening in South Dakota. The bill, House Bill 1096, is a bill that would ban what's called commercial surrogacy. Commercial surrogacy is where a surrogate is basically paid, may have no relation whatsoever to the what's called the intended parents, the parents that the child will be going to. Probably has no relation with them, and is paid to basically carry the child. Excuse me. And basically what's happening here is that South Dakota is banning this idea of commercial surrogacy. And this would really limit the idea of surrogacy in general. There's really two different types of surrogacy. You have what's called commercial surrogacy, and then you have what's called altruistic surrogacy, where typically you might see a family member or a friend carry the child to term, but they're not compensated for the pregnancy itself. All right. Now, let me just simply say this. Laws that allow for surrogacy, both altruistic and commercial surrogacy, certainly allow, and basically it does, we know that this happens, where embryos are created, human embryonic children are created. And basically this idea of this bill that's being put forth in South Dakota, and does have a lot of support in South Dakota, is, at least from my point of view, is that it would limit the number of embryonic children that are created, and it certainly would limit the number of embryonic children that are destroyed. Now, let me backtrack for a moment here and explain my reasoning in this process, because I think it's important. A lot of people don't really realize this when it comes to the in vitro fertilization industry. Let's just face it, when it comes to this industry, the industry doesn't just create one embryo for the implantation. It is routine that many embryos are created. And, as a result, what you have are extra embryos that are left over as a result. And so, for example, one article that came out back just this last August, back in August of 2019, stated that there's probably over 1 million frozen embryonic children that are basically being cryopreserved, and their parents have abandoned them. They're just there in storage. And so these were the extra embryos that were never used. So in some cases, you have these extra embryos that are either frozen, or they may even end up destroyed because the parents say, I've had enough kids, I don't want any more kids, so let's destroy them. or the clinic themselves may have a contract set out with the biological parents that simply says, if you don't claim them after such a period of time, they destroy them and so forth. In many respects, this is the backdrop that we're looking at when it comes to surrogacy. So we know when it comes to this particular issue for surrogacy, they're not going to just make one embryo. They're going to create many embryos. And this poses a huge problem because we know as a result that these many embryos, those that are left over, if you will either be destroyed or frozen, cryopreserved perpetually. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge abuse. And that's certainly a particular reality, if you will, that the pro-life movement must look at. This is a must. This is an ought. This is, definitely a duty that we need to do, okay? Why? Because we all believe that at the moment of conception, you have a unique individual new member of the species Homo sapiens. You have a brand new human person at that moment of conception, and they deserve the right to life. And so we as a pro-life movement need to look out for these embryonic children that are in a very precarious sort of situation. So it's our job to look at it. Now, again, as I said a moment ago, my belief is that if you ban commercialized surrogacy, what's going to happen, at least in South Dakota, is you're not going to get as many people that are interested in doing IVF, if you will, because typically what happens is these are the parents that either don't want, or especially maybe the biological mother that doesn't want to get pregnant, or the intended mother doesn't want to get pregnant, or for reasons of biological reasons, they may not even be able to get pregnant. But the simple fact is that they're less likely to use IVF in this regard. Why? Because they just can't. It's not easy finding someone that just wants to carry a surrogate. So, for example, if we look at, the celebrities, the many celebrities that talk about how they use surrogates, we don't see people said, oh, yeah, I did this for altruistic reasons. I did this just completely voluntary because I love this celebrity, or this celebrity is my sister. We don't hear cases like that. So these cases of altruistic surrogacy are certainly far and few between. Typically what happens is someone's paid for it. And so if you're not going to be able to pay for it, you're less likely to engage in the action that's going to create embryonic children. You're going to be less likely, as a result, to have these embryos destroyed. And that's what we want to do. We want to ensure that lives aren't destroyed. And this is radically important. And I think this is a good first step. So I certainly pray for the passage of House Bill 1096, and I certainly praise South Dakota Right to Life and its folks over there for supporting this bill, because I think this is very clearly evident a pro-life issue. And again, I praise groups that are coming forth and pushing such measures, because we need to start looking into measures that limit the various harms of the in vitro fertilization industry. And I think this is a good first start. Some other sorts of things that we need to understand as well. I think it's also important to look at legislation. For example, when we look at the in vitro fertilization industry, regarding reporting requirements. We do this for abortion all the time, for example. And I think it's important that we start doing this in the IVF industry. So, for example, if we go back and we look at abortion reporting requirements, for example, we talk about how many abortions were performed, what types of abortions were performed, what was the gestational age of the mother, what was the age of the mother. We get all sorts of data from various states, right, that do abortion reporting requirements. And we get all sorts of stats as a result from those particular states. Well, I think pro-life states need to look into the same sort of thing when it comes to the in vitro fertilization industry. How many eggs are retrieved from a surrogate? What are the ages of the surrogate? What were, basically the financial backgrounds of the surrogate? Were they considered impoverished? Were they college students? And so forth. How many embryos were created during a period of time? How many embryos were implanted? How many embryos were destroyed? I think the numbers might be rather surprising for a lot of people. And again, and I know I've stressed this in another video in the past as well, I know the IVF industry isn't really keen on letting these sorts of numbers out because, again, they kind of want to surround themselves with an aura of mystery, if you will. The less people know, the more likely these people might come in. They may be able to fool them. But if you have these stats that are out there, I think this is important information. But I really think it's important information, especially for legislators and especially for pro-life public policy advocates that are out there trying to design laws that protect life. Why? Because it gives us a solid picture of what's going on, at least numerically, what's going on. How many embryos are created versus how many embryos are destroyed, and so forth. It certainly also gives us the opportunity to define what exactly we mean by human embryo. The IVF industry is keen on using terms such as pre-embryo. Well, this is not a scientific term. And as a result, it's meant to confuse people. And so under the law, we can certainly use this term. We can define it as, obviously the zygote, which is the earliest stage embryo, one cell stage embryo on up. And so it certainly gives us the opportunity to see what exactly the IVF industry is really doing. And it certainly provides the pro-life movement the needed information in many regards to help pass needed legislation to help protect the lives of those embryonic children. Well, again, thank you so much for tuning in. Give us a big thumbs up. We always appreciate it, right? And if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and always share. And guys, if you ever have questions, always post in the comments below. I'll be glad to get back with you. And again, I hope you all have a blessed weekend. And thank you so much for everything that you do out there. All right, God bless.